But again, that's where I think building that foundation of hopping on a single leg and teaching them at a lower amplitude, a lower intensity is going to transfer as they increase their jump height over time. Again, 10 years ago, I would have been like, put a band around your knees and, oh, like we got to do lateral band walks. But again, like, is that transferring? I don't know.
Welcome to the Athletic Edge podcast. I'm your host, Liam Evans, strength and conditioning coach and owner of Evans Performance. This is a podcast tailored for athletes, coaches, and parents interested in every facet of athletic development. Join me and guests from around the world as we dive into game-changing tools and expert insights covering strength training, performance enhancement, and long-term athletic development strategies. Uncover the keys to elevate your athletic potential, drawing from trusted resources to safely and effectively navigate your training and build your athletic edge. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's show, we have Missy Mitchell-McBeth. She is a strength and conditioning coach, soon to be author and consultant. She has over 17 years of coaching experience, both at high school and collegiate levels. Thank you, Missy, for coming onto the show. Really appreciate you being here.
Absolutely. Liam, thank you for having me.
No problem. Do you want to just give people maybe a quick background on yourself, and then we can get into it?
Sure. So, update on the number of years, 20 years at this point.
There you
I
go.
started as a high school volleyball coach, got into strength and conditioning basically by force. I liked to lift. And so the head sport coach put me in charge of the weight room. So I learned a lot about it, realized that that was my calling in life, and ended up transitioning into a master's degree, which led me to an internship at TCU, which led to a full-time position there. I was there in total 7 years, working women's indoor volleyball, women's basketball, and women's golf. After that, decided to take a step back to the high school level for a little bit more work-life balance. And I was the or not head volleyball coach, the head strength and conditioning coach at Byron Nelson High School in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for 6 years. I'm currently employed with an equipment company, a strength and conditioning equipment company called Powerlift. So I work in sales by day, and then I'm the director of sports performance for a medium-sized volleyball club in the Dallas-Fort Worth area called Fieldhouse. On top of that, I am about to, as you mentioned, launch my first book. It's called Developmental to Division One, and it's basically a strength and conditioning resource for people who work in the volleyball space that maybe either want to learn more about volleyball strength and conditioning, or they're a sport coach that is like I was my first few years, thrown in the weight room and you don't know what to do. So that's kind of my target audience there. And then that's part of my company, Safe Iron, where I do consulting. And that's kind of wrapped in with Missy Mitchell-McBeth Sports Performance, where I do all the things.
Perfect. So actually, we can start there. Why did you feel the need to write the book? Kind of what gap did you see, or thing that you need to fill that gave you the itch to write the book?
Number one, full transparency, I just got tired of people asking me questions about, like, as an example, I'm guest authoring a chapter in someone's upcoming book, and they're like, what are great resources for sport coaches who don't have a background in S&C but need to learn more? And I'm like, well, there's not that many out there.
Hmm.
Zach Dakin's book, Movement Over Maxes, is one that targets the baseball space, but there's nothing out there for volleyball. And so you've got all these like volley influencers on Instagram and whatnot pumping out quote unquote content. None of it is suitable, in my opinion, for the developmental level. None of it is systemized where a coach could actually take it and put together actual training programs. And so I wanted to build a resource to not just help current me, where I don't have to
Hmm.
answer those questions quite as often, but also to help people like my former self be able to navigate the overwhelming volume of information that's available and find what is best suited for their athletes based on training age, based on the constraints that they work in. So both an active service to others,
Hmm.
but also just to put something out for myself.
Yeah, and obviously we live in, especially all of our developmental athletes live in a very information rich world, and especially in social media and things like that. What kind of guidance can you give to them on some of the things that they might see on Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, as far as training videos? I'm sure you get all sorts of questions about, oh, can we do this exercise? Or I saw this person doing that. How do you kind of guide these questions?
First of all, I kind of just address that preemptively in parent meetings of like, you know, when you run up to me and say, "Hey, have you seen?" I'm like, I have seen it because I'm the first person, as I'm sure you are, that if something crazy training wise surfaces on the internet, all of your Gen Pop friends are sending it to you like, "What do you think about it?"
Yeah.
And so I'm like, the reason that something's not included in our program is either it's not appropriate for you as an athlete based on your training age, based on your sport, based on our facility, based on our time constraints. It is not a lack of knowledge on my point or a lack of exposure to what's out there that we're not including it. And then, I think that's an educational opportunity. A lot of coaches kind of get mad about that. And I did early in my
Hmm.
career, but if somebody comes to me with something crazy, like that's a great opportunity for me to say, here's why we don't use it. Here's what we use to instead that actually addresses this pain point that you're bringing to me. And then the other thing is just approach things with common sense. Everybody is, and I just said it about myself, I'm about to be selling a book. Everyone is selling a product. And what doesn't sell is basic training progressions, which is actually what my book is about. So maybe my book doesn't sell. I don't know. But, that doesn't sell. What sells is 3 ways to develop lower body power. And then it's some stupid lateral band walk, side shuffle, and a jump. That doesn't develop lower body power. I just tweeted about that a couple days ago. The 3 pounds of band tension doesn't develop power. You and I know that. So it's like, use your eyes, use your common sense. If someone's promising you a 7-inch increase in your vertical in 2 months, like maybe they had that happen. We all have our own like N of one studies. We all have our own one outlier athlete that did that, but use common sense when you're looking at things. And I think that when approach athlete, everybody's looking for a quick fix. I get it. Like I love that sensationalized stuff myself. I'm like, ooh, new supplement or new this or whatever.
Yeah.
But ultimately, like you have to sit back and evaluate, like, does that really work or is this just a marketing tactic?
Yeah, and I think we have to realize, and again, you and I know this just from being coaches who do stuff on social media, is those are like the biggest thing you want is, the hooks that'll grab people's attention, and yeah, simple progressions of regular exercise don't really do that. So it is almost, I mean, you hope that people are just trying to get them in the door and at least have good information post that, or can at least put it all together into a solid program. But there's a lot of people on social media that don't have to have, much credibility other than they look good or they can themselves jump, 40 inches or whatever it
Sure.
is.
And what I will say about that is, I actually did a video yesterday because every time I put something out, I'm like for volleyball, for volleyball, for volleyball. Well, I'm
Hmm.
doing that to like hit that search engine and like tap the algorithm, right? And without fail, I get someone that's like, well, it's not just volleyball, it's for everyone else. And I'm like, I understand that. But I have to know who my target audience is and address
Hmm.
those people specifically. So if I get them in the door with the word volleyball, and then they come in for general athletic development and they buy into that, then I've done my job. So I don't want to take a shot at some of these influencers or whatever, because it's very likely that behind that lateral band walk and stupid shuffle thing that I just talked about, that there is actual training program there. We
Hmm.
just don't necessarily see it. So yes, sometimes you do, like you said, have to get that hook in people. But I think it's really important to, again, just like kind of vet it from the standpoint of, if it sounds too good to be true, like it absolutely is.
Yeah, definitely. Even in regards to the volleyball situation, how much with your developmental athletes, how much actually would you call, as parents probably come to you and say, I want volleyball specific training? How much of it would you call actually specific to volleyball? And how much is just general athletic training?
Honestly, I would say 0% is specific to volleyball unless we are out on the volleyball court. Like the
Yeah.
closest that we're gonna get is I'm kind of working a lot on approach mechanics,
Hmm.
right? So that's going to directly transfer to the volleyball court. So that's a little bit more volleyball specific than, say, just going and doing like some general plyometrics, or general acceleration training. Like we're working on accelerating with a specific technique in our footwork, but that's like, I don't even want to say 10% of the time, like
Yeah.
2% of the time. And what, the thing is that even when I was at the Division 1 level, like the specificity there was even probably we're looking at 90% of the programs across the three sports of women's golf, women's basketball, women's volleyball were very similar. It was more chopped up based on how much time I had with them. I had more time with women's basketball and women's volleyball than women's golf. So therefore they were at higher steps in the progression. So I think that people really overcomplicate training and they overblow the whole like sports specificity thing when it really is just very general athletic development. And I'm getting on a little bit of a rant here, but
No, it's perfect.
the time to do that is when they're young, because when we get to higher levels of technical and tactical demand, the actual sport itself, to make progress at that time takes a lot of energy. So, like, we want to have all those fundamental movement skill boxes checked, all of the general strength, power, speed when they're young. That way, we're not having to go back and teach them how to move when they're older, when they need to be focusing on that little like 0.05% of their sport skill that's going to make them more successful on the court.
With that population and a few other athletes, maybe swimmers, baseball, anyone else that is heavily shoulder based, is there anything specific that you might do just as maybe a prehab or anything along the lines of shoulder mobility, whatever it is?
Somebody asked me for my go-to shoulder resource the other day and I was like, honestly, it's just a healthy understanding of biomechanics.
Hmm.
Because if you understand what impacts the shoulder, which, to simplify, the scapula and the thoracic spine, right? So what does the scapula need to do for good clean overhead movement? It has to be able to upwardly rotate, it has to be able to posteriorly tilt, it has to be able to retract, okay? I know that those are the movements that are required to hit a volleyball. Therefore, I can address those things with, for upward rotation and posterior tilt, like a Y, or a Cuban press, which I call a row rotate press. So if I understand the anatomy, if I understand the biomechanics, then I understand what movements to implement in my training program. But it then even goes even like a layer deeper than that of, if you get down to it, everything in your program is arm care,
Yeah.
right? Like learning how to breathe impacts the thoracic spine, which the scapula sits on, which impacts the health of the shoulder. So it's like by simply breathing properly, you can increase internal rotation, range of motion. And then the other thing with that is like, then you can start talking about, okay, well, the core. Well, if an athlete has an energy leak in their core, if their core is not strong, now all of a sudden, like they're having a swing, they're having a serve using just their arm. They're much more injury prone than they would be if they're actually using their entire body. And, then you can get it down into hip and then you can get down into
Hmm.
foot contact and how that impacts. So I think when people use the reductionist approach of like, let's just go tie a band on the net and let's go do a few random arm movements and like maybe we retract a shoulder blade once or twice, maybe we come up overhead. I think we really miss the boat on the big picture, which is any joint is going to be a function of all the joints and things that surround it.
Are there any more general exercises that you see people maybe they're doing them in an unsafe way, but they could be doing them in a more biomechanically friendly way, for instance, around the shoulder?
Yeah. So with volleyball athletes specifically, I don't bench press them, and that's one of the more like controversial things that
Hmm.
like people get upset about that because they're like, "Oh, the pec is like the primary accelerator." I'm like, "That's great," but on the whole, people do not bench press with good technique. They
Hmm.
flare their elbows out, same as they do in push-ups, and there's just a lot going on there. So it's like, there's also, the scap is like back there fixed between a bench and a load. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily know that that's really the best setup. So for me, I tend to favor, and full disclosure, I've never worked with men's volleyball players. So people will hear this and be like, that's not going to be enough stimulus to use push ups.
Hmm.
And not to promote a gender stereotype of like girls are weak and all that kind of stuff. That's not it. But generally speaking, when I'm working with low training age athletes, push-ups are a struggle. They are a sufficient stimulus to get them strong. So that's kind of the direction that I go with my pressing movements is versus the bench press. I use a lot of push-ups, but I also use a lot of landmine press variations.
Hmm. Perfect. And with as far as the breathing side of things, what specifically are you kind of doing with your athletes?
It really depends on the context. Right now, I'm not doing a whole lot other than to if we're doing like a thoracic spine rotation, something, we're inhaling when we're opening and then we're exhaling when we're closing. And I try to teach like some breathing mechanics, but in the amount of time that we have, and I really, with the club setting in the US, kids might play for you for that club season. That's it, 6 months. That's all I get
Hmm.
them, and then they move on to the next club and you never see them again. So full disclosure, like my development strategy right now is to expose them to as many quality movements as I can in that 6 month time period, knowing that they may never do strength and conditioning again. Previously, we used to do just a ton of like diaphragmatic breathing, like at the collegiate level. I had an entire like a was it 6 part? Man, it's been a minute since we've done it. A 6 part series that, there were some movements correlated with it, but basically it was about breath work, which the athletes always felt an enormous difference in their movement patterns afterwards. And then I've toyed around with RPR stuff.
Hmm. So have I.
Yeah, and I mean, like, obviously, like, I get to where I'm like, is it really the RPR, like the, digging into your flesh stuff?
Yeah.
Like, are you really hitting reflex points, or is it just simply that you're focusing on using your diaphragm when you breathe? I don't have an answer for that. I kind of tossed that one by the wayside just because one, it's like weird. I'm in a gym with like
Yeah.
parents and it's just weird. It's weird,
Yeah.
honestly, right? And then also, you have about one or two kids in there that will actually like do it correctly, and everybody else is just sitting there like laying in a
Yep.
circle, right?
Yep.
So, yeah,
They really gotta buy. For most, and it's situational. Occasionally, I'll still use it, but for the most part, I see so much more benefit, or not more, but still benefit just having them do some diaphragmatic breathing essentially before, and things seem to turn
sure.
on neurologically after that. Um,
Right.
is this? Would you have been doing these things kind of in warm ups, pre-game, pre-lift, anything like that, or throughout the lift?
Yeah, so from a breathing perspective, I primarily like emphasize that in warm up. And
Yeah.
then, if we have an opportunity later where it's like, I feel like it's critical to point this out, like during the lift, we'll get into it. But generally, it's kind of one of those things where we all have these neat ideas if we're going to take everything and we're going to use it all the time. And like, okay, like we've got to, correlate the breathing with like squat and Valsalva and like blah blah blah. And it's like, but then you get going in a session, and for me, I haven't trained a group less than 10 kids, but generally my group size is 24, and at the high school level, I was like 60 and up.
Yeah.
You have to kind of pick and choose your battles in those types of scenarios. If I were working one to one or very small group training sessions, different deal. But to scale that kind of stuff again gets back into what we are just
Hmm.
saying of like, you can teach them, but how much are they really doing at that stage of their development?
Yeah, definitely. Even with the volleyball athletes, what sort of kind of progressions are you, if you have an athlete coming to you day one and say they're a developmental athlete, what sort of boxes are you trying to tick off with them, and are there any tests that you want to do before with them, things you might look out for? How do you approach that?
I may have a different answer for you next year, like once I kind of sit back and look at it. But from a testing perspective, what we use this year, and this is not necessarily like a movement assessment, but
Yeah.
we looked at RSI, and counter movement jump was really it. But as far as like, do I get my kids in and do a movement screen? No, I just look at them and warm up. And it's like, okay, how do they move? What's tight? Like, can they hit certain positions? Those are some of the things that I'm looking for. And then again, you have to look at, can you individualize, can you scale in such a large group setting when you only potentially have kids for 6 months?
Yep.
My answer is probably not. But some of the things that the boxes that I want to check, again, they're developmental athletes. They don't get fundamental movement skills in elementary school. They don't climb trees. So things like reaching, twisting, bending, catching, throwing, kicking, like crawling, just skipping, just basic stuff. We try to
Hmm.
package those things into their warm up to kind of build strength in different area of their bodies. So kind of some gymnastic stuff. Like we do a lot of crawling patterns. Sometimes, like especially my younger ones, like we'll do cartwheel relays because number one, they like it. And two, that's some different movement patterns that they might get. If we're getting into more structured stuff like in the weight room, people don't like it. They think it's too basic, but squat, hinge, single leg, push, pull,
Yeah.
like carry, brace, rotate. Like I'm not reinventing the wheel there. Like those are things that are important in strength and conditioning for a reason. And so I start with, every movement has a starting point in the progression. Like with a squat, for example, I start with a counter movement squat. And we generally start on a wedge and we do it on a tempo. So I can see, can they hit depth on a wedge? Can they control the eccentric portion of the movement? Can they keep their torso vertical when they're doing that? And then, can we move them off that wedge quickly? Can't, you know what I, and so everything starts that way. Push ups, we start with a high plank. Can they hold a straight line from head to heels? Most athletes, they can't. Then we're going to move into an eccentric push up, right? So, just very, very basic movements. Like I said, fundamental movement skills, then very basic weight room stuff, regardless of age, is kind of my starting point. And then I'll evaluate things from there and make changes as I see them progress and as I see fit.
What about as far as obviously a big, kind of KPI for volleyball is jumping. What about as far as kind of a plyometric progression for these? And I say plyo, but it could
Okay.
just be jump, hop, whatever it is.
Jumping. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. So on that note, if you're not following Matt McInnes Watson's work, anybody listening, if you're not following his work, like you're doing yourself and your athletes a disservice. So, there is the stance of like everything extensive, and then we're going to move from extensive and we're going to generally increase the amplitude of the jump and the intensity of the jump over time, which I think that there is some merit to that. But here's the deal: my athletes are out on the court doing intensive plyometrics all the time. So I probably need to be teaching them how to decelerate those loads and change directions from those types of plyos in training sessions. Generally, what I do though is I try to expose my athletes to a wide volume and wide type of extensive plyometrics. So I used to be very like, okay, we're going to do this exercise for 6 weeks, and like then we're going to do the next one for 6 weeks, and then it's like they're landing 70 different ways in a single set of volleyball, but we've now practiced one landing 70 times in training. And so I don't necessarily know that we're preparing them. So to me now it's like, again, we're doing extensive plyometrics. We are working on a midfoot contact. We are working on having the body stacked so that they can appropriately apply force to the ground and dissipate the forces. But we're going to do that 15 different ways. And then I used to be like, okay, well, we have to do bilateral and then we progress on to unilateral. And now it's like, nope, like hopping, we're just going to hop all the time. Like it may be lower intensity, it may be an extensive plyometric, but we're going to start with low intensity hops, get them where they can control forces on a single leg. Now we're going to increase either the jump height or the speed. Um, I use implements selectively with plyometrics and with jump training. I feel like with large groups, it helps kind of give athletes a target to go to. But I don't think the whole like we have to be jumping on a box and progressing the box height over time and we have to have hurdles out. I don't really think that's the move for plyometric progressions.
Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, the other way to progress is just adding volume over time. And this is something where I'm kind of my views are changing a little bit with plyos of I used to be like, okay, well that box is already that bucket's overflowing in their sport. And it is, but at the same time like we do have to teach them how to land and teach them that plyometric action, and I don't believe that they learn that necessarily very well in the context of sport because it's always or very often so intense. We need to learn how to do that with extensive plyometrics and stack on more volume over time so that they can tolerate more and more load in their sport.
Hmm. Would you ever think of things even along the lines of, maybe a box jump is almost like a kind of early progression just because they're not landing with the same amount of force, things like that.
If I could rewrite my book chapter, I'd probably rewrite it a little bit differently than what I wrote for my plyometric chapter. But yes, jumps to a box are one of the earliest things that I do with an athlete just to teach them exactly what you said. We're learning to jump and land, we're learning to use our arms, but then you're not having to dissipate the same kind of force that you would either landing on the ground or doing a box step off, because I think a lot of people will start that progression with just like step off and land, and it's like that's much more force than having them jump and land to a box, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't read a
Yes, yeah.
research article in about 100 years.
Yeah. Our I guess in volleyball it might be a little different than in basketball, where in basketball there's a lot of 1 foot and 2 foot jumps. I'm assuming in volleyball it's mainly, if it's an approach jump, it's mainly off of 2 feet. But do you kind of play with 1 and 2 foot jumps?
So you'll have athletes jumping off of 1 foot. Generally, the takeoff is off of 2 feet, but the landing, which is much more concerning, very often is 1 foot. That's either due to, I had one athlete who I have never, to this day, she plays beach now as an adult. I have never seen this individual land on 2 feet, right?
Yeah.
Like that is just how she learned, how she trained. And the entire time I'm like, dude, like you are gonna blow your knee out. And she never has. But anyway, um, so thank the Lord. So
Knock on
you
wood.
have one, some kids just land that way. They've either been improperly taught or allowed to do it or whatever. Two, if you have a set that's wide of the pin and your attacker went in at the wrong time and they're having to manipulate their body in the air to hit that ball and make the save, or the set's really tight and they're having to maneuver around the block, a lot of times they'll land on a single leg. You'll see athletes landing on a single leg jump serving. And then there's also a slide approach that the middle blocker does that's a single leg. So you think that it's going to be primarily a bilateral jump and land, but you do very often see single leg onto single leg with
Mhm.
volleyball.
How worried are you if you were to see an athlete, maybe they're even just doing single leg hops or like a rudiment hop, whatever it is in training, and they're landing on one leg and knee valgus, their knees caving in, anything like that? How worried are you with that? And is there anything that you do specifically to possibly correct that?
Yeah, I used to, like if you see extreme valgus and bilateral movements, right, which is, I mean, you have to do a lot to blow your ACL out in a
Yeah.
bilateral movement. But I used to like really, really panic about that stuff. And I still like if I see it, like if we're doing dumbbell jumps or we're doing just regular jumps and like their knees are almost touching them, I will address it.
Yeah.
Do I think it's as critical and important as I thought it was 10 years ago? Again, not bilaterally. Unilaterally, I think we get into a little bit of a sticky situation there. But again, that's where I think building that foundation of hopping on a single leg and teaching them at a lower amplitude, a lower intensity is going to transfer as they increase their jump height over time. So it's like if I see that, we're going to try to probably versus, again, 10 years ago, I would have been like, put a band around your knees and, oh,
Hmm.
like we got to do lateral band walks. But again, like, is that transferring? I don't know.
Yeah.
I know that I had very few ACL tears across my career, like addressing it. Like I know people are like, well, you don't have to worry about when they're squatting. That's how they're gaining leverage. And I'm like, cool. But I also know that I've had very few ACL tears addressing those things. Luck, skill, I don't know. But if I do see it on a single leg, we're probably going to regress down to a point that they can control that valgus movement on a single leg and then try to build them back up from there. I will tell you that with all the extensive plyo variations that I've been doing, I'm just not seeing it as much anymore.
I have seen that it is kind of, it can essentially be, and I'll say coached out, but as they basically just get stronger or whatever it is, doing it over and over from an extensive standpoint, and then you just kind of hope that that transfers when things obviously get a little chaotic in a game. And obviously talking about all these jumps, we're also talking a lot about the foot and ankle complex, which for maybe for those that aren't in the strength and conditioning world don't see it as a major thing to talk about. Why is this something that's important, especially with court based jumping athletes, things like that?
Yeah. So on the lowest end of things, You look at a volleyball player, they spend their entire lives in ankle braces. Like I'm 40, so
Yeah.
I came from they were called active ankles, and they were this big plastic structure that you wore around your ankle and it like stopped movement, right? And then it's like a kid gets out of that ankle brace and they're like a baby giraffe, like rolling an ankle, or they just roll ankles anyway. So they're in ankle braces constantly. For those that aren't strength and conditioning coaches, if you have limited ankle mobility and effectively it comes from I don't have strength in a range of motion, so my body keeps me out of that range of motion to protect myself. Well, now if I'm forced into that range, I'm either going to get injured because I'm weak there, or because I'm pushing my body past a range that it has available. Um, so that can, restricted ankle mobility can lead to back issues, because now when I need to jump, or now when I need to squat, instead of squatting like using dorsiflexion, all of a sudden I'm leaning forward at my torso. So now if
Hmm.
I'm lifting weights, I have a back injury. From a jumping perspective, then you get a really hingy jumper. So that hingy jumper is using probably glutes and hamstrings, but they're not using their quads. So now we're actually restricting jump height. And then there's also the foot contact gets into that of, if I'm a hingy jumper, if I'm hinging in the final steps of my approach, my foot can't get in contact with the ground long enough, so I decrease my jump height because of that. So restriction in ankle mobility is a problem from not just an injury perspective, but also a performance perspective. I think I kind of touched on
Hmm.
both of
Yeah.
those. But and overall, that just lends itself to the concept that we want to produce force, okay, but then we have to apply that force. And we all understand physics, equal but opposite. The more force I apply into the ground, the more ground reaction forces that I'm going to get, higher I'm going to jump, right? So the foot is where I apply that force into the ground. So if the foot doesn't work, if the ankle can't generate stiffness, elasticity, like then I have a problem. All the beautiful force that I've created in the weight room is for naught, because I can't apply it into the ground on the court.
Yeah, exactly. And it's almost, I guess, situational as well, because we want the mobility for certain things of the ankle joint, and then also in the tendon stiffness to be able to apply those forces. Is there anything that you're doing outside of just generally solid, good training to improve, say, ankle mobility or even stiffness, or are you using any isometrics or anything like that?
Use kind of a multifaceted approach. So one, as barefoot as often as we can.
I was going to ask if you
Our
do.
warm Yeah, our warm-ups, my club director is amazing, and I walked in when I was talking to them about taking that position and said, "You have this nice area outside of the building. Why don't you build me 35 yards of turf, like
Hmm.
15 yards wide?" And he was like, "You got it." So he built me this turf. So we have this beautiful, cushy turf that our athletes can train barefoot on. So that's one. We'll usually do something in our warm up, whether it's just a half kneeling dorsiflexion out of their shoes, or we might do something as simple as like ankle circles for time, right? So, like everybody loves FRC, they love ankle cars. Okay, that's all well and good, but that requires kids to create like some internal force and be mature,
Hmm.
and,
Yeah.
kind of come back to what we're talking about earlier with RPR, may or
Yeah.
may not happen. But 15 seconds of ankle circles, like you are actually like activating some of that small musculature. And I feel like when I get up afterwards and just go walk around, I feel a difference. I got that from Charlie Houlihan out of Louisiana. He's a PT out of Louisiana. Anyway, just real simple, clockwise, counterclockwise for 20 reps, and then dorsiflexion, plantar flexion for 20 reps. And it like smokes out your lower leg and
Yeah.
ankle. So, we'll do those things. I actually let my athletes, because once I get them out of their shoes, they don't want to put their shoes back on. They feel good. They understand they can feel their foot contact better. And I think that that's really where the money is it's like, again, just like the shoulder, we can do these little chippy prehab exercises, or we can just train in a different range of motion without our shoes on, and we're going to get more benefit because that's going to transfer more, right? If I need range of motion when I'm sprinting, well, what better way to do that than by sprinting without my shoe on?
Yeah. And you mentioned sprinting. So obviously, when we think about volleyball, it's not a huge court. They're probably never getting up to max velocity, anything like that. Why do you sprint with your athletes, and why is it so important for even sports that aren't, field based, longer running sports outside of track, obviously, why is it important for everybody to kind of have sprinting in their program?
Yeah, so I talk about this a little bit in the speed chapter of my book, but basically, again, general athletic development, right? That the lower your training age is, the more a general capacity is going to transfer to improvement in sport skill. So with sprinting, coordination, that's pretty important for every sport. Rate of force development, that starts to get into takeoff velocity in a jump.
Hmm.
Okay. And if I can get to a block faster than my opponent, that's a good thing. Faster contract relax cycles, again, back to coordination. And then, I've talked about the force application through the midfoot numerous times. For volleyball athletes, like they've been coached their entire lives, like be on your toes, be on your toes, be on your toes. So they're very toey jumpers.
Hmm.
And so they have poor force application as a result. Well, if I can take them away from jumping and I can do like A marches, A pops, A skips, those types of things, teach them to strike through that midfoot. Now, all of a sudden, when we move into our rudiments or extensive plyos or whatever you want to call them, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, that thing that you were just doing in an A march, that contacting on the back row of your spikes or, whatever coaching cue you want to use, that's where I want you contacting when you jump. So tying it into jumping. The other thing, the real reason is that despite volleyball not getting up to max V, you actually have a ton of accelerations on the court. Do they look like accelerations out of a 2-point stance? Sometimes, maybe. Sometimes they look like a setter accelerating to a ball. But the AVCA, which is kind of the coach's body for volleyball in the US, they have what's called their VPI. It's a volleyball performance index. And I'm not exactly sure how they vetted it, but it's an it's an 8 movement assessment where athletes can upload all their stuff into a database. And the number one on there is a 15-foot acceleration. So a 5 yard, roughly 5 meter acceleration. Well, what does that correlate to? That correlates to their attacking approach. So if you're able to accelerate better, then you're able to apply the force from that acceleration into an increased jump height. So where it doesn't on the surface look volleyball specific, there actually is a pretty big carryover into the sport.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And it's something I guess now a lot more programs are adding in. And there's been, even on social media and stuff like that, it's becoming a lot more broader of a topic. One thing I did see you, I think it was you, maybe post, and this, we're gonna say volleyball, but there's a lot of sports that this could kind of go with and might open up a can of worms. But something along the lines of volleyball players shouldn't lift heavy weights because they're gonna get bulky and slow. How are you approaching this question?
I just think that people need to like park their time machine back in like the 60s. Like, just that's, I mean, it's just such an antiquated take when you look at, everybody wants power. They want explosive power. And I'm like, okay, power is force times velocity, but you don't want to generate any force. So I don't understand how you think that, like, okay, when you're little, like goblet squatting a 20-pound dumbbell is going to cause you to increase your force production.
Mhm.
When you're a 180-pound, 6'3" collegiate athlete, you're going to need a little bit more of a stimulus there. I think the fear mongering comes from, and I want to be very clear that I am not taking a shot at football or football coaches. What I'm taking a shot at is stupid practices in the weight room where it's just get in there, lift as heavy as you can with no regard to technique. I think that's where people become fearful because it's like, yes, there is an injury risk from lifting weights. It can be the most dangerous room in the building. And when it's traditionally been the domain of football, like for myself as an example, I didn't grow up lifting weights because our coaches didn't grow up lifting weights.
Yep.
So they didn't know what to teach us. So if we wanted to lift, we were going to have to go anyway. There's just not the same education in the volleyball coaching community, which is part of why I wrote my book. But so lifting heavy weights is not dangerous. It's not dangerous at any age. Lifting light weights with bad technique is worse for you than lifting heavy weights with great technique. So I don't know that I necessarily I don't I don't really see that, honestly. I don't see a lot of complaints with that. I more get kids bucking lifting heavy because they legitimately are really fatigued because they play year round. So it's and they have a practice that night. So it's like, oh, I don't want to lift heavy because I got practice or whatever. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I get it. I do. I play beach volleyball still, and, like, in the winter when I'm lifting heavier, I'm like, "Oh god, I gotta get on the court and my
Yeah.
legs are gonna be smoked." So, I mean, I totally understand it, but that's primarily where that gets from. But, yeah, I think I posted something about Christmas. I was like, "Don't make fun of kids who believe in Santa because some of y'all think
Y
lifting heavy
yeah, that
weights is
was it.
bad for volleyball." That's what my post was, yeah.
Yeah. How
Um
are your athletes? I know you said you train them for 6 months. Are they training elsewhere still in season or year round, or no?
So it really depends. So we have, with club volleyball, you get most kids still play high school, and the geographic location that we're situated in, most of the schools around us actually have really good strength coaches. And so I know, I mean, like some of them are close personal friends, right? So I know that a lot of my athletes are having the lifting bucket filled at school. So I kind of have taken the approach of I know what I had time to do as a high school strength coach, and I know what I would have liked to have seen my athletes doing more. So I try to supplement what they can never get too much of. Um, Upper body pulling. So we'll do chin ups, rowing, that kind of stuff. We'll generally throw in a shoulder prehabby exercise because my gosh, parents love to see it, kids love to see it, coaches love to see it. So let's throw them a bone every once in a while. Single leg, you're not going to get too much single leg stuff. And then all of our movement stuff outside. Again, sprints. Most of them are not sprinting. I did a kind of an intake survey with all the kids to see what school they went to, what their program was like, and tried to fill that stuff in accordingly. The athletes who don't get strength and conditioning at school, you might look at that and be like, well, they really got to get in there and grind and lift. And it's like, but they have no training background whatsoever. So really anything I'm doing is going to be making them stronger. So I think that we've been able to walk a pretty good line with our programming where we're not crushing the kids that are already getting something, but we're giving the kids who get nothing enough to, get some development.
So I guess the club that you're based out of, kids all go to, I assume, different high schools, maybe in the same general area. And we know what it kinda what a collegiate application looks like for a strength coach. What is a high school? Are they still kind of expected to have similar, if not the same qualifications? What are kinda those positions looking like now, especially in the States?
So, when they are full-time high school strength and conditioning coaches, not just again, using football,
Yeah.
not just the football guy that also does, and again, anyone listening, I'm not taking a shot at it. I actually have some friends who that's how they started, and my mentor was a football strength coach, like outstanding people, outstanding strength coaches. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is the one that's just in there because like he's big and he likes to lift, right? So outside of those individuals, the full-time high school strength coaches generally have to have a CSCS or an SCCC certification. A lot of them are actually coming down from the collegiate level, like I did.
Mhm.
Most states are going to require that you have, like Texas, you have to have a Texas teaching certification. So I think generally speaking, I haven't seen an overabundance of those positions go to people that I'm like, wow, that was a horrible hire. Generally speaking, I see them getting filled with people who do have a pretty decent background because the high school level, I've said this a million times and I'll say it a million times again, it's not an entry level position. It's an entry level athlete. But if you don't have great systems in place, it is really difficult to train 400 to 600 athletes across the course of a training week.
Yeah, definitely. I was always curious kinda what that looks like, especially on the US side of things. Um, and I don't wanna keep you talking, we'll wrap up soon. One thing I did wanna touch on is your kinda advice, I guess, to parents and how they can best help their sons or daughters. as far as just developmentally and coming up in, you know, a competitive sport environment?
I think the best way, and I'll another preface here. I am not a parent. And so I never want to be seen passing out parenting advice. But what I am is someone who's been in the coaching world for 20 years. So I've seen parents do things that have uplifted their kids' sport experience. It is an experiment too. And I've also seen parents that have made their kids' sports experience worse. And I think that things that you can do to make the experience better for your kids is let the coaches coach and you be the parent. Don't expect the coach to be the parent, and don't drive your kid home from a game evaluating their performance, or worse, talking about all the things that their kids did wrong. That applies in the strength and conditioning realm again, because you as the parent, this is the example I gave in a parent meeting. It was parents and kids. Kids are all sitting down in front, parents are in the back. And I pointed to a kid and I said, "Hey, do you have a brain?" And the kid goes, "Yeah." And I was like, "All right, cool. I need brain surgery. Can you do it?" And the kid was like, "No." And I was like, "Why not?" And she's like, "Well, because I'm not qualified. I didn't go to school." And I was like, "Well, what if I gave you some YouTube videos and I let you watch them? Could you do my surgery now?" And she's like, "No, no, no." And I'm like, "Okay, right." And I was like, "Parents, this is the knowledge gap between you who played high school football or you who goes to CrossFit and me as a strength and conditioning professional." I think the question is really, how do they vet us, right?
Hmm.
How do they vet trainers, like people
Yeah.
running around cones and stuff, versus actual strength coaches? I think that that's really, really challenging. So I think going back to what I said earlier with the Instagram stuff, if someone is promising you something that sounds too good to be true, they're probably not going to deliver on that. Things that you can look for credential wise, um, this is controversial. People get really, really upset. But again, we're talking about people who don't know how to know that someone at least has some qualification. Lowest entry barrier in our field, the CSCS exam,
Yep.
right? Doesn't make you a good coach. Uh, don't use anything out of the book really anymore, but it just shows that you have the scientific background and you took the time to do it. So parents, look for some form of certification. I don't think it has to be like, I have a master's degree in strength and conditioning. That's great. I don't think it has to be that. I think there's a lot of people that are self-taught that are outstanding. But I think some kind of credential can be really helpful. I think also, if you look at something and it doesn't look right, like, it's probably not right. I think most people are fairly intuitive. Like, when you look at something and you're like, that looks like it could hurt somebody, it probably could
Probably
hurt
could.
someone,
Yep.
right? So using just logic and common sense, I think, can go a long way. And then just talking to people about what their background is, or talking to former athletes or coaches that have worked with them, just to kind of feel them out. I don't unfortunately have too much more advice on that. You could, you know what, you could read first chapter of my book where I talk about what strength and conditioning is not, and kind of go from, and then I talk about what it is and kind of go from there. So shameless plug, buy the book.
Definitely buy the book. And the last thing I like to end these with is just maybe a quick piece of advice that you have for, it could be a younger you as a volleyball athlete, but just younger athletes in general.
Yeah, so don't neglect the strength and conditioning side of things. Younger athletes are very often super excited about going and playing at the college level, and that's awesome. You should be, or you should have some kind of aspiration in your sport. But understand, at the college level, you're going to spend more time with your strength and conditioning coach in your first semester than you will with your sport coach, because it's that important. So prioritize it now. That way, like I mentioned earlier, when it is harder to get just a tiny fraction of a percentage better at your sports skill, you're not having to allocate that energy back to relearning how to crawl, walk, jump, because you didn't learn those things on the front end. So find some time, like the model is play year round, compete year round. I want to sit here and be like, take 2 months off.
Yeah.
I don't take 2 months off from playing beach volleyball. Now I don't play 100 tournaments a year and all that kind of stuff, but that's the current model. Like you're not going to take 2 months off, like no matter how much we preach it. But because of that, it's that much more important to be involved in strength and conditioning. And I think for those that maybe don't have aspirations of college and they're just playing for fun or whatever, also understand that strength and conditioning can still be important because it's a life skill, to learn to have a healthy, positive relationship with what your body's capable of doing through exercise.
Yep, I think that's a perfect way to end it. Do you want to just give people a quick any more plug or anything where they could find you or any information on the book, and I can leave some in the show notes.
Oh, of course, I would love to tell you where to get the book. So, timeline on it. We discussed this before going on air. Soon, today is the 23rd of May. So, hopefully, by early June, we're starting to ship. But Missy, Mitchell-McBeth.com, you can go download and read the preface in the first chapter for free, or you can go to d2d1book.com. And then, of course, all my follow me on my socials. So,
Perfect, and I will leave most of those things down in the notes of the show. So, thank you very much, Missy. I appreciate your time.
yeah, thanks for having me on.